Hello, Hazel. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Protecting Our Vote Colorado Town Hall. Tonight, we will discuss what you can do to ensure the safety and security of our elections. We are fortunate to have several experts in the area, and you will be introduced to them as we go along. I am Toni Larson, Action and Advocacy Director for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. And here also from the League is Andrea Wilkins, Staff Legislative Liaison. Besides this forum being sponsored by the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan education and advocacy organization with a special interest in making democracy work, it is being sponsored by Declaration for American Democracy, a coalition of over 160 state and nationwide organizations that have come together to advance and strengthen our democracy, including People the American Way, Public Citizen, Union of Concerned Scientists, Communication Workers of America, and the League of Women Voters of the United States. We're here tonight to discuss the urgent threat of the coronavirus pandemic and to its impact on our democracy. We'll be joined by voting rights champions, including Senator Michael Bennet and Representative Jason Crow, who will talk with us about the importance of providing resources to the states to ensure a safe and secure election in November. We'll also be joined by Secretary of State Jena Griswold and former Secretary of State Wayne Williams to discuss our current voting system here in Colorado. As we hear from our esteemed speakers and as they respond to your important questions, please keep in mind actions you can take in your state and with Congress to ensure that every person will be able to participate in our democracy, despite the pandemic. So there are a couple of things that I would mention that you can do already, is call your senator and tell them why it's important to you that states receive the $4 billion in funding needed to protect their voters and their poll workers. Write a letter to the editor of your newspaper explaining why you are supporting vote by mail, early voting, and other key reforms to ensure that no person has to choose between their health and their vote. Also, get the message out by sharing with 5 friends on social media. I will now turn this over to Andrea.
Thank you, Toni. We'll get things started with the first of our exciting lineup of speakers tonight. Michael Bennet has represented Colorado in the United States Senate since 2009. He's recognized as a pragmatic and independent thinker and is driven by an obligation to create more opportunity for the next generation. Michael has built a reputation of taking on Washington dysfunction and working with Republicans and Democrats alike to address our nation's greatest challenges, including education, climate change, immigration, healthcare, and national security. Senator Bennet will share information on how the U.S. Senate plans to take steps to secure our vote in the next COVID-19 relief package.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm very grateful to be with all of you and glad that you guys are all here tonight. I'd like to thank the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition and the Colorado League of Women Voters for organizing this call. And to everyone on the phone, I can't thank you enough for making time on a Wednesday night to be part of this discussion. I just got off the phone with a whole bunch of Coloradans from Southwest Colorado, a real diverse group of people. And on their list of things was making sure that we had ballot access and we were paying attention to it. So I want you to know that we're hearing from everybody about this. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and your families and your loved ones during this difficult time. And it's important so that you can be of use to others as well. We've got an enormous challenge on our hands, enormous challenge. In 6 months, we're going to hold the most important election in our lives. And the chances are growing that we're going to do it during the worst pandemic in a century. Everybody saw what happened in Wisconsin when people had to literally risk their health to cast their ballot. That should never be an acceptable trade-off in our democracy. And it was a chilling reminder of what could happen if we don't do everything we can to make sure everyone can vote safely in November. Thanks to the leadership of so many people on this call, and I want to say how what a wonderful Colorado symbol it is that we have the current Secretary of State, Jena Griswold, a Democrat, and the former Secretary of State, my friend Wayne Williams, a Republican, now a citywide elected leader in Colorado Springs. It's this kind of leadership has made Colorado, it's put us in actually a much better position than the rest of the country since our transition to the vote by mail system that we have. Now we're in a place where the overwhelming majority of people don't vote in person, and we have the second highest voter turnout in the country. She's not here to say it, but if she were, Amy Klobuchar, my colleague from Minnesota, would say Minnesota is number one. I would do anything not to have to hear her say that anymore. So if Colorado could be number one, that would be great. The rest of the country is looking to Colorado for leadership because of the turnout that we've had, and we need to step up. You know, even though I feel better about the situation in our state, it's taken us years to get where we are. And I'm deeply worried about the other states that haven't taken the steps that we've taken to strengthen their elections. And I'm worried that at the very moment when states need the most help, mindless partisanship in Washington is once again standing in the way. I know it can be frustrating, and but we can't allow these frustrations to slow us down. We have to understand that the obstacles we face are not immovable. Last year, Mitch McConnell said he wouldn't give us another nickel for election security. We pushed and pushed and pushed, and he agreed to another $425 million in funding. That was in the first COVID bill. In March, he said he wouldn't give us another cent for election funding, even though we were in the midst of a pandemic. Sorry. And we pushed, and that was another 400 million. The first was 425 million election protection. And this is another 400 million in the CARES Act, which is a start. It's a start. But as you know, it's nowhere near what the country needs. We need up to potentially $3.6 billion in additional funding. So we've got to keep pushing, and I'm going to do everything I can in Washington. I don't think that every Republican in the Senate shares Mitch McConnell's view of these matters. There are a number of Republicans that have supported the election protection legislation. It's been bipartisan because they know their states need help. They knew their states needed help when what we were trying to deal with was the Russian attack on our elections. Now with the pandemic, I hope there will be more that will come. And just a few weeks ago, for example, Senator Susan Collins joined me in sending a letter urging an end to the requirement for states to put up a 20% match to access the 400 million in new election funding. State budgets are getting cratered. They're in tatters right now because of the pandemic. And the last thing they need is for Washington to impose these kinds of rules on them that not only will make it fiscally impossible for states to be able to help, but will threaten the right of people to vote. So at least on that front, there's evidence of some progress, and we've got to build on that by continuing to push our government in Washington. I know it's not easy with a president who's saying what he's saying about vote by mail, that it's a fraudulent system, or with the broken politics in DC, but those challenges aren't excuses to throw up our hands, just the opposite. They're invitations for us to roll up our sleeves and do the work. And to be honest, we don't have a choice. As broken and as dysfunctional as the politics in DC are right now, this democracy is how we make our decisions as a country. And our exercise in self-government is really at risk. So unless we're content to sit back and do nothing, which I know you aren't because you're spending a Wednesday night on this call, then we got to join together to fix it. And I don't have to remind the people on this call that we've had to conduct elections at hard times before, during a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a Dust Bowl. And in the face of those difficulties, generation after generation of Americans have stepped up, cast their ballot, and sustained this democracy, the oldest in human history. That's our job now. And because Colorado has already done so much to lead on these issues, I know we're up to the challenge. So I'm going to end it there and use the time I have left to take any questions, criticisms, or observations, whatever you want to share. And please know that you don't have to wait for these calls to let me know what you think, not just about these issues, any issues. You can always contact my office at 303-455-7600 with your small business issues, your unemployment issues, your immigration issues, your healthcare issues, 303-455-7600. So let me thank you for everything you're going to do between now and the election to make sure that people get out and vote. And Andrea, I'm going to turn it back over to you and see if anybody's got questions or criticisms, ideas, thoughts, anything.
Thank you, Senator Bennet, for those insights.
Thank you.
We do have some questions from the participants. Our first question: I understand there is broad support for reforms like vote by mail, early voting, and other important reforms from Republican and Democrat secretaries of state. Can you debunk the idea that vote by mail and other reforms are a Democratic power grab?
Yes, I will debunk that. What we saw in our state is that actually in the first few years that we had vote by mail, that Republicans were the ones that were filling out their ballot and sending it in, and so it was thought to give Republicans a little bit of an advantage in a sense. What's happened over the years is it's evened up. And by the way, it is. I don't think in the end we should be for vote for mail because we think it helps either party. I think it helps both parties, and I believe Colorado's experience demonstrates that. And in my view, what I've been saying to people is a system that works really well in normal times, this vote by mail system, is required when we have a pandemic for all the reasons that people know. I had one little note on that, which is Donald Trump has said over and over again that it is rife with fraud, the vote by mail, and that is absolutely not true. None of the states that have it have detected any fraud as a result. Andrea, you may be muted.
You're right, I was.
I see your lips moving, but I don't hear anything. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for that. We do have another couple of questions that have come in. Our next question, we know that the post office is essential for vote by mail and absentee voting. I'm concerned about the lack of funding for the post office for continued service. How can we ensure that voters will have access to the post office in November?
Can you still see me? I lost you for a second. I apologize.
Yes, I can still see.
We've got a situation right now where the post office, who is building back, they really were making progress. They're now getting sort of whacked by certain people in the Congress who've got an ideological axe to grind with the post office. I never really understand that because, you know, some of the places where the post office is most important are the most rural and reddest parts in the state of Colorado, and they're the lifeblood of our community. Right now, there's been an effort by certain people in the administration, not by Republicans necessarily in the Senate, to try to use this moment of a downturn to kind of screw around with the pension that the post office has. What we have to do is make sure that in these COVID bills, we're funding the post office so we know that it is alive and working for this election, and that's under threat. I believe there's bipartisan support in the Congress to make sure that we fund it through the election in the COVID bills that are coming.
Fantastic, thank you. And another question that's come in from our audience. During the Wisconsin primary, voters were unnecessarily forced to risk their health in order to exercise their right to vote. And many were potentially disenfranchised because they didn't receive absentee ballots in time or could not risk their health to vote in person. These complications are particularly harmful to racial and ethnic minorities, older adults, immunocompromised people, voters with disabilities, and others. How can we ensure that what happened in Wisconsin never happens again, and especially the right to vote for historically disenfranchised people is protected?
That's what, you know, we in the short term, I think that's why we've got to get this vote by mail across the country and fund it out of the federal government. And by the way, the one group that I would add to your list are poll workers, many of whom are senior citizens who do this year in and year out and have done great service to the country, who shouldn't have to risk their own lives in making sure that we've got our ballots mailed and our ballots in. So I think the best way is to fund these bills. I also believe that either you're a friend of the democracy or you're not, and if you are, you're for extending the franchise, not taking it away from people. That's been our commitment in Colorado, and I think it's paid off, and that's what we need to do across the country. People shouldn't be scared of this. Donald Trump has said that he doesn't want to do this. He's explicitly said he doesn't want to do it because he thinks it will disadvantage Republicans. There's no reason that has to be true, and I don't think that that's the position of the local elected officials that I know, by and large, that are Republican, who think it's very important for their constituents to be able to cast their ballots by mail.
We have actually a comment that's come in, not so much as a question, but one of our participants wants to note that she's very proud of the way Colorado helps all people vote. And it's especially proud because seniors in our states don't have to go to the polls and risk their health to vote. So something that we can be really proud of in Colorado, and it's a point well taken.
I think it's certainly an important point. And, you know, I was one of those people that thought it was sacrosanct to go to the polls on election day. And I've changed my view. I just think what's important is to make sure as many people vote as possible, and to see give our seniors the chance to be, look at it this way. There will be seniors all over America, if they don't have access to mail ballots, who are completely disenfranchised as a result of that. That's why what you're doing is so important.
Absolutely. And it looks like we do have a couple of other questions that are coming in. Why is it the experience of someone voting in Colorado is so different than the experience of someone voting in Georgia? What can the federal government do to ensure all Americans have equal access to the ballot?
You know, I'll let the secretaries of state answer the question about why it's so variable in different places. We've sort of grown up with that. There are things, though, that we can do. The federal government, you know, I don't know whether, I'll let the secretaries of state answer that, I think. But let me say, I do think there are things that Congress could be doing at the national level that would make our votes more relevant. So this is not just an issue of more of mail ballots. I believe we should be ending partisan gerrymandering in this country, the political gerrymandering that causes people's votes not to count because they might live in a place where they've got a different point of view than the prevailing point of view, but they never are able to express it really because there's not a swing district. I also believe, this is just me personally speaking, I've become very interested in ranked choice voting, and I have a bill that wouldn't mandate that from the federal level, but it would allow, it would provide funds for states and for local governments that want to transition to a ranked choice voting way of voting, which again is meant to make sure your votes actually count and aren't wasted, because we could have a system where the winning candidate is known to have over 50% of the vote and therefore represents a majority of the people that are voting in that community. So I do think as a country, there are a lot of things that we can do here. This moment with the pandemic presents a particularly existential threat to our democracy, but it also presents an incredible opportunity for us across the country to learn from what Colorado has done and implement it across the country.
Absolutely. So many great points there. I think we've got one last question maybe. And actually, I think maybe it kind of connects back to what you had mentioned in your last answer. In your opinion, what's the single most important thing people at home can do to make sure this upcoming stimulus package has what we need to protect our elections this fall?
I would call your state representative, or I'm sorry, your congressional delegation, let them know it's a priority for you. Let them know that we've got to help states and local governments because they have a profound revenue shortfall as a result of the pandemic. And we've got to backstop at least some of that so that they can be able to hold the elections, do the public health stuff that they need to do. We've passed $3 trillion of stimulus, but only 150 billion of that went to states and went to local governments. And of that, almost none of it got to the smallest places, the most rural places in our state. And we need to be worried about everybody voting, no matter what county they're in, no matter whether they live in a rural part of Colorado or urban part. We've seen in this pandemic, the differentiation that people have, one part of our population that has decent health care, another part that doesn't have any and therefore doesn't have primary care and therefore is more susceptible to the virus. We've seen, as a former school superintendent, kids all over Colorado where 50% of the classroom has no access to high-speed internet and the other half does. It's the same thing with voting. We got to make sure, just as every kid needs to have high-speed internet, just like every kid needs a textbook, we got to make sure that every single community has access to the ballot. And the experts that are on this call tonight with all of you are going to be able to tell you the substance of that, the policies of that. What you need to make sure you do is get people like me to fund it. So if you know people in other states, call them too, and get everybody to the polls in November. That's what we have to do.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Bennet. We
Thanks,
really
everybody.
appreciate your time and all of your
I'm going to
insight.
drop off because I'm unfortunately for me, I'm in Washington, D.C., but I hope to be in Colorado tomorrow. So thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you so much.
Thank you.
We're excited to hear from our guests tonight and to offer our viewers the opportunity to ask them questions. For those of you that are joining us on Zoom, you can add your questions to the chat box. Those watching on our Facebook live stream can put your questions into the comments, so we'd really encourage you to do that. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Councilman Wayne Williams. Councilman Williams served as the Colorado Secretary of State from 2014 through 2018, during which time he oversaw implementation of Colorado's vote by mail system and a number of other voting and election reforms. Since April 2019, he has served as an at-large member of the Colorado Springs City Council. Councilman Williams will be speaking to us tonight about Colorado's election and voting reforms that were authorized during the 2013 legislative session, as well as the structure that it was put in place to make it a success.
Thanks for the opportunity to be with you tonight. And let me kind of give a quick primer and a background, and then talk about some of the protections we have, and then open it up to questions. Colorado really moved to voting by mail over a course of 3 steps. The first of those was allowing no excuse absentee voting. That's something that is not present in every state, but Colorado has had that for a long period of time. And then in 2008, we moved to the ability for a voter to say, always send me a mail ballot. And what we found is that many Coloradans preferred that method of voting, in part because in Colorado, we trust our voters with a lot more than other states do. We have initiatives. Government can't raise taxes or go into debt without voter permission. And so we actually make our voters the decision makers for lots of things. And that means people like the time to study the ballot questions in detail. And so we went from, I think it was 39% in 2006 who chose to vote by mail permanently. That was up to 72% by 2012. One of the advantages we had of implementing it over time is that we were able to look at processes and procedures that make that process work. And that's something that a state trying to move very quickly to it would have some challenges with. But let me talk a little bit about what we've done and what some of those processes and protections are. First, we have to have accurate voter rolls. You cannot mail ballots out if you don't actually have accurate voter rolls. And we do a number of things in Colorado to ensure they're accurate. We work with the US Post Office to get change of addresses. We work with driver's license. So one of the things we implemented when I was secretary is that automatic update that exists. If you change your driver's license address, we're able to automatically do that. We haven't done that with everything yet. So doing it, for example, with respect to responses to juror questionnaires would be an additional help, so that when you tell the government you've moved, we know you've moved and we send you the correct ballot at the correct address. We also work to make sure our rolls stay accurate. And so we get a list of people who've died from the Department of Public Health and Environment. And we also started participating in the Social Security Death Index in case someone died in another state. And so one of the things that undermines confidence in the process is if people look at the voter rolls and say, well, those aren't accurate. And so you need those to be accurate. We also check in Colorado citizenship to make sure that individuals who are registered indeed are citizens. We also participate in ERIC, which is a consortium of states and allows us to check and see whether someone may have voted in multiple states. And we had a few of those instances when we ran that check, and we followed up on that. So my good friend Michael Bennet did talk about some of the challenges and some of the concerns. It's not true that there's no fraud, but the important thing is that fraud be prosecuted. And we have done that here in Colorado. We've referred matters to the DA, and that's an important step in ensuring the integrity of the process, is you have to be willing to follow up on those. There's then processes protections. So we have, when you shift from a pristine polling place where you are completely free from coercion, you have to have a process in place so that individuals who may be in an environment where they might be subject to intimidation or coercion have the ability to vote in that pristine environment still. One of the issues that we deal with in Colorado, and we have protections against, is ballot harvesting, where people come and claim they're taking your ballot, but then dispose of it if you perhaps aren't the person who voted the way they wanted you to. Making it easy for people to return their ballots. So we established drop boxes across the state of Colorado. Before we did that, we had elections in which ballots were not delivered in a timely manner, and that impacted the results, for example, in the Conejos sheriff's primary a few years ago. And so now Conejos County has drop boxes so that they're not dependent upon that post office. It's one of the challenges in a state like ours that has large urban areas where the Postal Service does a very good, and except in the midst of a pandemic, a very timely mail delivery, but that's not true in some of our rural areas. And so making sure that all Coloradans have that ability to get that ballot back in a timely manner is important. Then the next step is that when that ballot comes back is making sure we check signatures. Colorado has had the time to adopt signature verification processes and to have an updated signature verification database. States moving to that would have to work very hard to have accurate list. There are some states that have vote by mail that do not check signatures. So absentee ballots, they don't check the signature on that. That is a system that is ripe for fraud. And so you have to have those protections in place like we do in Colorado. We expanded that from state elections to also include municipal elections. But we still don't have a process in Colorado whereby special district elections, like took place yesterday across the state, have that signature verification. That's one of the things I think we need to continue to work toward, so that we know that that ballot that's returned is from that individual. We also have bipartisan judges throughout the process. We then verify those results in a risk limiting audit so that voters can have confidence that those ballots were counted and were counted accurately. All of those are important steps to ensure you have an election that people have confidence in. When any type of election, whether it's polling place, whether it's vote by mail, or whether it's some other system that someone else may come up with, you have to have the processes first so that it's easy for people to vote. Second, so that it's fair, that everyone has that opportunity to participate, not divided by whether you live in an urban area or a rural area. And then third, you've got to have that process for ensuring the integrity of that. Colorado has done that. Now, the initial legislation passed in 2013 has been revised a number of times to address some of the issues that were present in the initial legislation. For example, one of the odd provisions was that you could vote if you simply intended to live in an area. That got fixed very quickly in the next legislative year, and we've continued to make improvements. A state moving to the type of system that Colorado has would have the advantage of being able to look at all of the steps that we have taken and the processes we've put in place to ensure that everyone can be assured that their vote is counted and that it's counted accurately. And so those are some of the things that our election judges work on across the state. Important part of that is we've got bipartisan election judges in every county. Doesn't matter whether you're in Denver or El Paso, whether it's a Democratic clerk or Republican clerk, you're going to have bipartisan judges so that you know that process is safe and you've got both sides watching it to make sure it stays that way. So those are some of the things we've done in Colorado to have that protection. As states look at moving, and this is one of the challenges and one of the cautions I'd say is you don't necessarily want to mandate the way another state does things. New Hampshire, for example, a lot of the states bordering Canada, as the senator referred to, like Minnesota, have very high voter turnout, and they're the ones that challenge Colorado for that top spot. Sometimes we've been number one, sometimes number two. But in New Hampshire, there's very little vote by mail, and it's mostly in person. They have a process that's worked for them. And so as the federal government adopts programs and standards, it ought to be on the goals and allow the implementation to be done best by states and by local governments, who oftentimes know what works better in their community than it might be somewhere else. As the Secretary of State of Colorado, even looking at the differences between places like Julesburg and Denver, there are significant differences in the way those parts of the state, those counties need to run their elections. And so providing an ability for incentivizing, for establishing goals and standards, but still allowing states and local governments to figure out the best ways to implement those is an important part of federal legislation. We have to recognize also as we go forward, as states want to make changes, can they practically do that? Are there the necessary is there the necessary supply chain? And talking with some ballot vendors, that's one of the concerns. Are there constitutional provisions in the state constitutions? All of those are things that would cause me to be wary of each state must do it like Colorado. I happen to think the way we do it is very good. I think it's very risky that my friends in New Jersey and Georgia have systems without a voter verifiable ballot, where they don't actually know it was counted in a particular way. And so I think we need to continue to provide training, incentivize, but we have to be wary. Having been a local official on a number of occasions, we have to be wary of standards that may not apply uniformly across the country. I was up in Alaska when they were shipping out ballots for their primary. They had to ship them out on specific days because planes only traveled to some of their small communities once a week to deliver ballots. And so if they weren't there that day, it was going to be a week later before they could get them. And so all of those are things that change and vary across our nation. But the processes we've adopted in Colorado are ones that make it so that people can have confidence in the system. And that's important, not just that the system be accurate, but also that people have confidence in it. Because if you believe that your voting system is honest and accurate, then you are more likely to participate in our democratic republic. And that's an important part of having that confidence. And that's an important part of the processes we have. So that kind of gives a very quick overview. I know that there are a number of panelists here who are providing information, but happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Well, thank you so much, Councilman Williams. That is a lot of great insight and a lot of practical knowledge that I think is really helpful for our audience to hear and for people in other parts of the country as well. We do have a few questions that have come in from our participants. Our first question is, how has the opportunity to vote by mail and early voting affected voter turnout in Colorado? And can you discuss why ensuring every American having access to the ballot is a nonpartisan issue?
Sure. Colorado actually was amongst the leaders in voter turnout in the nation before we switched to vote by mail. We continue to be one of the leaders in vote by mail. Much more relevant to voter turnout is whether voters believe they have actual choices to make and their knowledge of the choices. And so you see across the country, people vote more often in presidential elections. Part of what we've seen drive turnout in Colorado is our robust initiative and our initiative process and our taxpayers' Bill of Rights that allows people, even if they don't like any of the candidates, they may still care what's going to happen on cigarette taxes, or should marijuana be legalized, or other issues that may be important. Will the local school be expanded? And so that actually has a much greater effect on turnout. We were among the nation's leaders before. We are, and we continue to be under this current system. For me, the ability of everyone who's legally entitled to do so to vote has never been a partisan issue. It is about trying to make sure the process is fair, that people know their ballots are going to be counted accurately, and everyone's going to be treated the same. And I think for most people that isn't partisan. So it doesn't mean that you're trying to say, well, I want to make it easy to vote for my voters. It means we're trying to make it easy to vote for all voters. And that's an important part of what the message has to be. And there's a distinction a lot of times between some people in legislative roles or executive roles versus people in the actual election administration role. And our focus in almost every state that I've dealt with and virtually every county that I've ever dealt with has always been, how do I make sure this process works well for my voters? How do I make sure it's fair to everybody? How do people have confidence in that process? I saw a question on the chat, I'll go ahead and respond to, which is, does signature verification bog down the process? And I'm summarizing it. We've set it up so it works very smoothly in Colorado. We've got a great signature database. It's updated every single election. And so after the election, clerks and their staff scan in the signatures. So we have current signatures. And that process makes it work well. You have in some of the larger counties, the same type of software that banks use for signature verification that does an initial pass. But in even our smallest counties, we have the ability for individual judges to look at that screen. There's a barcode on the ballot envelope, not the ballot, that scans in, and that pulls up the signature so the judge is able to look at that signature. And if there's a question, it goes to a bipartisan team of election judges. If it doesn't match, it doesn't get counted, but the voter's told about it. And so when I was clerk, I sent one of those letters to my own daughter saying, "Dear Wendy, your ballot signature, your ballot envelope signature does not match your signature on file." When she got her driver's license, it was a proud day. She spelled out every letter. But by the time she had gone off to college, it had become a scrawl. And we gave an opportunity to cure. And she took advantage of that opportunity. And we give until 8 days after the election. That's one of the processes that helps ensure you've got the integrity, but it also ensures everyone has the opportunity to cure that signature if there's an issue with it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Councilman Williams. We really appreciate your time and all the information that you've been able to share with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me with you.
All right, shifting to our next speaker, Jena Griswold is Colorado's 39th Secretary of State. She was elected to office in 2018 and is the youngest elected Secretary of State in the United States. During her time in office, she has spearheaded campaign finance reforms and is working on a number of election security issues. Secretary Griswold will be speaking with us about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on our elections and how Coloradans can safely vote.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through great. Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you to Aswar and Toni for all of your leadership. I'm so excited to have a late night or early night discussion about democracy. And of course, it's always great to see former Secretary of State and current Councilman Wayne Williams and Jason Crow and Senator Bennet, who just do a phenomenal job. So today I would like to talk about how we are dealing in the Secretary of State's office with the COVID-19 response, our upcoming elections, and then how our mail ballot election system is serving as a model for the federal legislation being crafted on also other states, which I think Wayne touched on. Now, I do think it's very timely to have this conversation because we are at a very important point in our democracy. And we have to remember our constitutional rights to vote do not stop in times of crises. They remain our same constitutional rights, whether we're in calm times or times of crisis. And no American should ever have to choose between their health and casting a ballot. And the good news is that I believe, and our office believes, it's completely feasible to expand national mail ballot to make sure that every American has the ability to cast their ballot in November. And not only is it feasible, it's imperative. Now, here in Colorado, which I'm sure my predecessor, Secretary Williams, touched on, we are proud to have some of the most accessible and secure elections in the United States. Under Secretary Williams, the law was implemented to ensure that every Coloradan who was registered to vote gets mailed a mail ballot. And our IT division really just took off under Secretary Williams to make sure that we are a national leader in cybersecurity. And then I've been very fortunate as Secretary of State to build on all of that success. So for example, last year, I was very proud to lead and work with the legislature, one of the largest democracy reforms in the nation, which Andrea, thank you for talking about our work on campaign finance and lobbyist reform and making sure that everyday people have their voice heard and it's not just special interests. But we also made sure that we were increasing access to voting. So for example, we added in-person voting locations and mail ballot drop boxes across the state. We're guaranteeing for the first time that there's access on all public college campuses and on our tribal lands at tribal leadership's request. We have also doubled down on election cybersecurity, heavily investing in our cyber and pulling the nation along with us, and we should be very proud of that. Now, when it comes to running an election during a pandemic, here in Colorado, we are far ahead of the rest of the nation. We have, and I am sure Secretary Williams discussed early voting, in-person voting, same-day voter registration, online voter registration, and of course, our great system of mailing a ballot to every registered Coloradan. And voters use our system. And what that means in terms of practicality with COVID-19 is that the majority of Coloradans, when they vote, they're already practicing social distancing. 97.5% of Coloradans in our presidential primary voted that mail ballot. And by the way, we had the highest turnout in primary history in Colorado and the highest turnout of any presidential primary so far held in the United States. So not only is our system great for accessibility, it also safeguards us from voting during a pandemic, which is just very lucky that we have this system in place. Now, with that said, we have a second primary coming up on June 30th. That's our statewide primary. And we've been working with all of our county clerks to put contingencies in place to make sure that we can, of course, have mail ballots go to all Coloradans, but also recognize that we need to social distance in our polling locations and also in the processing of the ballots. And I will say we're going to have in-person voting, the same as usual, but we really want to encourage Coloradans who can vote that mail-in ballot, who otherwise just like to vote in person, to do the right thing and help protect all of our health by just filling out that mail ballot. And I would really urge all of our 156 participants to just make sure that your registration is up to date. And it's very simple to do. You can do that at govotecolorado.gov. And we are just very confident that our upcoming June election will look like a lot of our elections for the majority of Coloradans, because most Coloradans vote their mail ballot. Now, I do think that what we saw in the last couple of months should really serve as a wake-up call for the rest of the nation. Last month, let's talk about Wisconsin. In Milwaukee alone, 180 polling locations were reduced to 5 due to a lack of poll workers who, were justifiably not wanting to go in. And that caused long lines. Thousands of people also requested absentee ballots and they didn't receive the ballots in time to mail them. So a lot of voters were put into this bad situation, a bad choice that no eligible American should have to choose. And that's the choice between their health and casting a ballot. I do believe that Wisconsin should serve as a wake-up call for the nation, a call to expand national mail ballot to every eligible voter before November. And voters in other states, they could really benefit from mail ballots, both to just increase voter turnout and accessibility, but also to make sure that we are controlling this health crisis while also maintaining our elections. I'm very proud to report, especially with Secretary Williams on, that the election division of our office has worked with almost a third of the nation so far in advising them how to rapidly expand mail ballots. And then we've also been working on all the federal legislation. So that includes Senator Klobuchar's mail ballot bill, Senator Harris's bill. And we worked also in the fourth installment of the stimulus, which provided an initial funding of states to be able to combat COVID and carry out elections. And we were able to get $400 million to states, which is a good step forward, but not enough to expand mail ballot nationally. I just think it's so important to remember that our constitutional rights, our fundamental right to have our voice heard in elections and our ballots counted, does not stop in times of crises. So it's time that every state expand their offering of mail ballot. And if they don't have it, start offering it immediately, because every eligible American deserves to have the same types of freedoms that we have here in Colorado. Just like us, they deserve to have their voices heard and their votes counted accurately. These are difficult times, but we are rising to the challenge. And I'm just so happy to serve during this time as Secretary of State, in that Colorado is able to lend a hand in some guidance to the rest of the nation. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Secretary Griswold. We really appreciate your time and all of your remarks tonight. We do have a few questions that have come in. Our first question is, while vote by mail works for many, there are some communities that may need to vote in person, or communities that have been historically disenfranchised as voters and may prefer to vote by mail. How can we ensure that there are safe options for voters that need to vote in person and that they can do so safely?
That's a great question, and a premise I agree with. I will say there's been some recent studies, both in the New York Times and I believe out of Stanford, that have shown that all communities increased participation when Colorado went to vote by mail. So all different communities are using it. But you're right, there are some people who either because of accessibility, historical practices, or they just did not get their replacement ballot, or they are registering for the first time, need that type of access. And so what we're planning for 2020 is a strong push to Coloradans to encourage folks to vote that mail ballot if they can. So like I mentioned, presidential primary, 97.5% of Coloradans voted their mail ballot and either sent it in the mail or dropped it off at a drop box. What we're going to be doing for our next elections is increasing drop boxes even more. In 2019, in the Colorado Votes Act, one of the things I was very happy to be able to include in that piece of legislation was expanded drop boxes. So we were authorized to, and by the way, our office was very happy to pick up the bill for counties. We were authorized to add 90 drop boxes across the state, and we're going to add even more. We did receive some money in the federal stimulus, and we're going to make sure that there's that access so people have that ability to drop the mail ballot. But we're also going to have in-person voting. We do want to encourage social distancing, and there's a couple things we're going to adjust, and we're working with the clerks right now on that. But for example, say you dog ate your ballot, okay, we'll make sure that ballot doesn't get counted. We'll take it out of the statewide voter registration system to make sure it's not counted. But it's too late. The clerk can no longer mail you a ballot. So instead of going into a polling location, let's set up like curbside delivery so you can pick up that replacement ballot. And say like you're in a residential care facility and you cannot go to the polls because for whatever reason, there's no egress or access into that facility. Okay, let's try to expand how we deliver ballots to our overseas and military voters to people who just for whatever reason are not going to be able to access the polls. So we're working on all different ways to make voting safe and accessible. We want to encourage innovation, ideas about voting outside, mobile voting, all different ideas are on the table. And the lucky thing is that even though these elections are going to cost a little bit more because we want to make sure there's social distancing and different ways to make sure that access remains, we have the federal funding and we are very dedicated to working with the counties to make sure that we pick up the tab and there's the access needed so that all Coloradans can have their voice heard.
Fantastic. We do have a few more questions. How do you respond to President Trump's assertion that vote by mail and other reforms that would make voting easier for Americans would lead to voter fraud? Is there any evidence that shows that fraud's a real problem?
That is a question of the nation right now. Unfortunately, I think the federal conversation on expanding mail ballots very quickly changed when President Trump started tweeting about voter fraud. But I will tell you, and to try to make this very clear, President Trump and what he is saying is a distraction. He said the quiet part loud when he said he did not want to expand mail ballot because Republicans would lose their seats. I believe that it's reprehensible for the highest elected figure position official in this nation to take that point of view, but it's also just wrong. We have a lot of Republicans who have won statewide in Colorado using mail ballot, and I agree with my predecessor. If you are getting your message out there and you're relating to people and people are enthused to vote, you can win, and this isn't about one party or another. But just accepting the premise and going down that road, I will say that we have a history of clean elections in Colorado, and we take the notion of folks gaming the system very seriously. I know Secretary Williams went over a lot of the things that we have, from bipartisan judges to signature verification, and our systems work. By the way, when we believe that there is double voting, we make sure to recommend those cases to the Attorney General under my administration for investigation. And from the 2018 general election, we had a percentage of 0.0027 of potential cases that we referred. And luckily, Secretary Williams, the legislature, a lot of great people over at Common Cause, all the you guys, the League of Women Voters, all the great groups who've worked on voting reform in Colorado have built a great system. So we do have bipartisan teams of judges verifying signatures to make sure that we know who's actually casting that ballot. We also have a law in the books that someone can only collect up to 10 ballots. And a lot of times when you hear that term ballot harvesting, which I think is coined to be specifically scary, there's laws that can be put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we have a great history of clean elections, but not only that, one of the reasons that the Washington Post in 2018 said Colorado was the safest state to cast a ballot, and then Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said the same thing, was because of our primary mail ballot system. The fact that we have voter verified paper ballot means that those ballots cannot be hacked by cyber attack. So not only does a mail ballot add a level of accessibility, it also adds a level of security when we know that foreign governments are going to continue to try to undermine our elections.
Well, thank you for that information. We do have one last question. It looks like it's a two-part question. Is there a single website that people can be directed to for information on Colorado vote by mail? And what do you and your fellow secretaries of state need most from Congress to hold successful elections during the pandemic?
Well, you can go right on to the Secretary of State's webpage, and there's an FAQ and all the information that you would need. You also just go to govotecolorado.gov. And if there's information that's not there, always email us or call the office. As Wayne can attest, the Secretary of State's office has hands down the best state employees in the state of Colorado, and they love their job and they love helping people. So feel free to call in. The number one thing that we need out of Congress is leadership. I do think that Secretary Williams brought up a couple reasons that make it difficult for every single state to mount national mail ballot. So for example, a couple of states do have constitutional limits, but every other state should be moving very quickly to make sure that their citizens could have their voices heard. And I just think that, look, we know the possibility of what is going to be November. And that's a pandemic and one of the biggest elections of our lifetime. And we cannot allow this pandemic to be used to suppress turnout. So we need leadership out of Congress. I'm very happy to lead and work state by state with states that are willing and wanting our expertise. But we need the federal government to make sure that people in Alabama, that people in Georgia and Florida and Texas have the same type of access that you and me have by making sure that there's early voting, mail ballots, and in-person voting. That requires federal legislation. That also requires the funding. All things worth doing are difficult, but this is not rocket science. We're talking about the ability to mail something to eligible Americans and return it and process it. So we believe that there's a way to lean on us and we'll be able to help states. So for example, instead of putting a scanner in every precinct, do a centralized state scanner so you can process, put your equipment in place faster and process the ballots. Like Secretary Williams mentioned, it's very important to start now talking with mail ballot vendors. And also signature verification is very important. But we can build these systems. I think it's Maryland is setting up signature verification for their primary, and they're going to do it. And all I can say is Colorado will be here to work with all the states and the federal government to make sure that every American can participate in this historical election and not have to face the horrible decision of risking their health or casting their ballot.
Thank you, Secretary Griswold. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening and share your perspectives. This information has been really valuable, and we appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you guys do, and I just look forward to continuing to partner.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to take a minute to quickly, kind of highlight some of the actions that you can take to make sure that your voice is heard on these issues. One of the most important things you can do is call your senator and let them know why it's important to you that states receive the $4 billion in funding that's needed to protect their voters and poll workers. You can write a letter to the editor explaining why you support expanding vote by mail, early voting, and other key reforms to ensure that no person has to choose between their health and their vote. And it's important to remember that social media is a great way to get the message out. If you can commit to sharing with even 5 friends on social media, we can really spread our message and, push for action. So we just want to, really be as action oriented as we can. Based on what we've heard so far, we do want to take a quick poll to see who's ready to take action here. Those of you on Zoom, you'll be able to select the way that you would like to make your voice heard on this critical issue. You'll see a couple of options to indicate how you can take action after the call, and indicate your commitment to either calling your senator, writing a letter to the editor, or sharing your this message on social media. We would love to hear from you. So if you can take a few minutes to answer the poll. Not sure. Hopefully everyone is able to access that. We'll give everyone just a few seconds to vote here, and we'll take a look at the results and see how everyone is planning to take action following the call. Okay, it looks like people have had a chance to vote. Most people are indicating that they are committing to calling their senator. 60% of our respondents are saying that that is something that they can absolutely do following the call. Another 8% have committed to writing a letter to the editor, and 35% have committed to posting this message and getting the word out via social media. And 29% are committing to doing all 3, which is fabulous, because the more action we can take, the more successful we can be. So we really look forward to follow up and action following the call. All right, shifting to our next speaker. As a former Army Ranger and lawyer, Congressman Jason Crow represents Colorado's 6th Congressional District, encompassing Aurora and parts of Adams and Douglas counties. During his time in Congress, Congressman Crow is working to strengthen our democracy and fight the influence of money in politics through ethics and campaign finance reform. The House passed his first bill, the End Dark Money Act and H.R. 1 for the People Act, which would close a loophole that allows mega donors to hide their political contributions. Congressman Crow will discuss actions that can be taken at the federal level to secure our vote and expand voting systems.
Hi, good evening, Andrea. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for putting this on, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, and to the prior panelists. So good to see Councilman Williams, Senator Bennet, Secretary Griswold, and to join you all. So I'm not going to plow through some of the ground that you've already plowed through tonight. I know you've covered a lot of ground. So I'm just going to mention a few things that I'm focusing on and that the House is focusing on in the next 2 weeks as we tackle what's going to be the 5th stimulus bill, or CARES Act 2.0, and then want to spend most of the time to address people's question. But really the long pole in the tent here, as you've heard from some of the prior panelists, is the vote by mail. You know, we are fortunate in Colorado in that we have one of the best systems in the country for vote by mail, and really a model for other states to follow. But you know, the disparities between the states and the broad range of voting accessibility, as many of the people joining us tonight understand, is really unacceptable going into a very unprecedented election cycle 6 months from now. We have to make sure that we are providing access to the franchise, and we can't be replaying situations like we saw in Wisconsin, where people are risking their health and the health of others to exercise their right to vote. So I've called on leadership on both sides of the aisle to make sure that very healthy chunk of funding is made accessible to the states to duplicate models like Colorado's to expand the vote by mail program. But vote by mail alone is not going to solve this, because we have another critical key here that needs to be addressed in the next couple of months, and that is the solvency of the U.S. Postal Service. As it stands right now, the Postal Service is running about a $13 billion deficit. It's projected under the current trajectory to go insolvent sometime in September. And of course, we can't have a vote by mail system in Colorado or anywhere else for that matter, unless we have a operating postal service to deliver those ballots and to retrieve those ballots. So that's going to be really important. The next key here is PPE. We have to make sure that we're providing personal protective equipment to our poll workers, to the Postal Service, to people processing ballots in the county clerk's office, and everybody involved in kind of the ecosystem of voting and democracy throughout the country and in Colorado. Right now, we don't have anywhere near the PPE or the testing that's necessary to return to 80 to even 90% normalcy. We have to make sure that we're driving that at the federal level. That's just simply is not going to be able to be addressed by states, counties, or municipalities. So I'm actually leading the effort in the House to push forward a Defense Production Act bill that would federalize certain elements of the medical supply chain to create a stockpile of PPE for all those uses, in addition to hospital uses and our healthcare system. So we have to address that component of this crisis as well. The next is funding for state and local governments. So under the original CARES Act, there was a threshold set at 500,000 residents per municipality to be eligible for CARES Act stimulus funding. So if you are a municipality under 500,000, which is most of the municipalities in Colorado, you're not eligible for that funding. The second thing that the CARES Act did to restrict the funding is it said that that money could only be used with respect to coronavirus specific expenses. So things that are directly related to mitigating or addressing the use or addressing coronavirus for municipalities. It restricted the use of any of that money to backfill revenue shortfalls. So the two keys to that in the next stimulus bill is we have to move that threshold down from 500,000 to 50,000, and we need to expand the use of those funds to backfill revenue shortfalls. Because in my district alone, cities and counties are projecting anywhere from a 25% to a 40% revenue shortfall. That's going to impact all services, including services that are essential to make sure that we have a smooth and effective voting system. So those are the things that we need to address immediately. I know Secretary Griswold spoke very briefly about cybersecurity, and I have a couple of bills meant to address the cybersecurity threats by Russia and other state and non-state actors throughout the world. What we have seen is in the last 2 months since we've been hit by the coronavirus, the number of cyber intrusions or attempted cyber intrusions on our election systems and on our government systems have gone up significantly. So we're going to be getting some briefings in the weeks to come, classified briefings to look at the nature of those threats, what's happening, and whether or not additional legislation is going to be necessary this summer to help give the government agencies, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, the tools that they need to secure our elections, much like they did in the final weeks of the elections in 2018, where they were able to essentially neutralize some of the efforts of Russia and other actors that were trying to undermine our election process. We have to make sure that we are in the same position as we were in October of 2018, leading up to the elections this year as well. So those are just a few of the efforts that we're going through right now. And I associate myself with a lot of the remarks of the prior panelists that understand these issues well. The bottom line is we just have to get it done. We have to get the money to the states, to the county clerks, to the secretaries of state to actually ramp up the voting by mail and secure the system. And we have to do it very soon. I think you're muted, Andrea.
Thank you. I keep forgetting to do that. Thank you for all those remarks. We really appreciate that insight. We do have audience questions for you. Our first question is, While vote by mail helps people vote safely from home, some communities need options to vote in person. What role can Congress play to ensure that voters who need to vote in person have the option to do so?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the two things that I mentioned that are going to be key to making sure that polling stations are safe and effective will be the PPE element and the testing. So we have to make sure that we fully invoke the powers of the Defense Production Act so that we can get the pipeline of personal protective gear to our poll workers, to our municipal governments, to our county clerk's offices, so they can actually be safe themselves and also not to pass the virus on to other folks. The second thing is the funding for state and local governments. We have to address this massive shortfall that our local governments under 500,000, which again is the vast majority in Colorado and throughout the country, are going to be facing very soon, right? I mean, we're talking about situations where, the 9 cities that I represent, unless we pass stimulus funding in the next couple of weeks and get that money flowing into those municipalities, in the 6th congressional district and in cities like them throughout Colorado, police, fire, teachers, basic services, road maintenance, all of that are going to be facing immediate cuts. So we can't allow that to happen. We have to make sure that we're maintaining basic government services, and that's going to be key to make sure that there's accessibility to the polling stations, to our schools, to all the services that the cities provide that actually allow the clerks to implement our voting system.
Thank you. And another question that's come in, what is the chance of providing return postage on mail ballots for all voters like we do for our overseas and military voters? Can we use COVID-19 funds for that?
Well, I mean, I would like to see something like that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think anything that makes it easier for eligible voters to vote and not have to, pay for that postage or find a place to buy stamps, which obviously is hard for a lot of folks if they can't travel, if our transit systems aren't operating like they normally do, if they're afraid for their own health, in the case of many of our vulnerable populations and seniors. So yes, I think that's a good idea. But we have a threshold battle in that the people mainly in the Senate don't even want to provide any money for the voting systems at all, let alone postage paid ballots. So we have to address that first massive hump, then get over the fact that we have to get them to agree in principle or find a way to get to basic voting by mail, and then we can talk about what that looks like.
Great, thank you. And another question, what's the single most important thing people at home can do to make sure that this upcoming stimulus package has what we need to protect our elections this fall, especially when it comes to exerting pressure on resident senators?
Yeah, that's the big one, right? I mean, we have some folks in Colorado who have the ear of Mitch McConnell, frankly, in the U.S. Senate, and we have to make sure that the Senate is going to come to us in reflecting the voice of their community. I mean, Colorado does this well, as you've heard, and as many people on this call know. We're a model, and we're a nonpartisan model, right? I mean, we've been able to implement this effectively across party lines, safely, effectively. And there's no reason why representatives from Colorado or senators from Colorado can't continue to be in the first instance an advocate for that model and go to Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate and say it's time to meet the House in a negotiation here and get this done for the American people.
Great, thank you for those remarks. And I think we have one more question. Why does it seem that there are some elected officials that are determined to make voting more difficult? And can you talk about the importance of ensuring that every American has access to the vote?
Yeah, I think there's this notion that has developed over time in politics that has made this a partisan issue when it need not be. I mean, actually, there have been some analysis that have been released, some articles and research that's been released in the last month that shows that increases in voter turnout benefit both parties fairly equally. In that, it doesn't benefit, Democrats, disproportionately. And those were some pretty well-respected studies. But what's happened is, in large part, Republicans have bought into this notion that that they're going to be the net losers if we increase access to the ballot box, and that there's this supposed fraud that happens if you increase that access, and there's really no good data that suggests that increasing access to the ballot box and the franchise actually increases voter fraud. There just isn't data that suggests that, at least reliable data. But that has become the rhetoric and the talking point. And there have been an awful lot of folks that have kind of painted themselves in a corner, I will say, because it's now, once you've made that case, it's hard to unmake that case. So that's the position that some folks are in, even though it's not necessarily backed by data and reliable information. We have to make sure that I think we're addressing it at a local issue, right? Because once issues become nationalized or federalized in Congress or other places, it becomes very political. And I think one of the best ways to actually make progress on an issue that has become political is you then localize it. You go back down and you talk to your county commissioners, your city councilors, your mayors, and others who actually have to get the services done and actually know how the system works from a nuts and bolts perspective, and get them to help make the case too, because they're very trustworthy local validators. And I spend a lot of time in my district working with those local leaders, those mayors and county commissioners, to talk about just those things and show that we can actually get those things done. So I think it's really important that we take it back down to the local level.
Well, thank you, Congressman Crow. That it is just really helpful to hear all your perspectives and your thoughts on this topic, and just some really great practical information for our participants tonight. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to introduce Nicole, Hensel, Dusti, Gurule, and Tamra DeBrady, who represent three important Colorado organizations: New Era Colorado, the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, and Colorado Black Women for Political Action, who have worked alongside the League of Women Voters to protect our elections and ensure the voting rights of all Colorado citizens. The leaders of these organizations are going to share some information on why elections and voting protections are so important to their members, and they're also available to answer some audience questions. So with that, I believe we will turn it over to New Era Colorado.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who waited for the real celebrities at the very end. We're here representing some major advocacy organizations here in Colorado. So thanks for sticking with us. And really want to thank the Declaration for American Democracy and the League of Women Voters, and of course, my esteemed colleagues for organizing and participating in tonight's town hall. My name is Nicole Hensel, and I'm the executive director at New Era Colorado. We are a nonpartisan, multi-issue civic engagement organization that works to mobilize and organize young people to participate in our democracy. In 2020, young people will be the largest voting bloc in Colorado and in the nation in 2020. For folks who've lived in Colorado for a while, you know that the streets are just, overflowing with young people. We're everywhere. And here at New Era, we've been building youth power for over 14 years in the state. Over the past 14 years, we've registered over 200,000 young people to vote, and we consistently turn out those same registrants at one of the highest rates in the country. We're peer-to-peer, we're fun, we meet young people where we're at, and most importantly, we're focused on the issues that matter most to our generation. And one of those issues is election access. Now, when you're in the business of expanding access to democracy, you first have to ground yourself in history, in the inherent inequities that were designed into our political system. Explicit intent to disenfranchise people of color, women, immigrants, and low-income communities. So our history shows us that we cannot sit back passively and expect our democracy to work for everyone. We must actively redesign our democracy to ensure fair and equal participation. Now, young people face specific challenges when it comes to voting. They're less likely to be registered to vote, and they often lack access to crucial information about the logistics of voting. Young people move frequently, impacting address changes, and they're new to independent interaction with government. And Councilman Williams actually mentioned this, but they're also most likely to have their signatures open to verification process because our signatures are changing so much. Young voters are new voters, and democracy takes practice. And so the biggest barrier that we find for young people is not apathy, it's access. And that's why we've won critical protections for election access, including same-day registration, voter pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, guaranteed campus voter service centers and drop boxes, and more. And as a result of these policy changes, we have seen expanded access to registration, which has increased Colorado's youth turnout significantly in the past 7 years, and we only expect those numbers to rise. And yet we know that barriers still remain. We know that vote by mail is not a panacea. Young people are the most likely to take advantage of same-day registration and in-person voting. And so we must keep those options available to the communities who most benefit from them, while also ensuring the safety of voters and poll workers alike during the current coronavirus epidemic. Something else that folks don't realize is that young people often lack access to stamps. If you're a parent with a kid off in college and they've asked you where to find stamps, like, welcome to the club. I don't know where my stamps are currently, but paid postage would really allow young people to vote safely from their homes. And I know that Congressman Crow spoke about this as well. We find that when we take down barriers, young people show up. And taking down barriers for one group leads to greater access for our most marginalized communities as well. Communities of color, low-income folks, the very individuals who were designed out of the process in the first place. Young people have an acute sense of justice and fairness, and we know that it's fundamentally unjust if a voter in Colorado has an easier time accessing the polls than a voter in Texas. Democracy works best when we all show up, and so that's why we call on Congress to increase access to voting, not only because we're living in an unprecedented global pandemic, but also because it's just necessary for the health of our democracy. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to share the perspective of young people, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate your remarks and the overview of the work that you all do at New Era. Next, we're going to turn to Tamra with Colorado Black Women for Political Action.
All right, thank you. Hi, my name is Tamra DeBrady, and I am the president for Colorado Black Women for Political Action. I do want to thank the Declaration for American Democracy for putting this town hall together and inviting our organization and all these great speakers on the panel for such an important issue for our community. CBWPA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit community and political organization that was started back in 1977 by the first Black female Colorado State Senator, the Honorable Gloria Tanner. And so for the last 43 years, CBWPA has been advocating and keeping the Black community engaged in politics at all levels, from local, municipal, all the way up to the federal level. And so we've done that in multiple ways. We're educating folks on issues, candidates, legislation, also on voter registration, voter education, endorsing candidates. We publicly support and oppose bills. And we train, candidates to run for office, our staff to run campaigns. And so, for communities like the Black community that have been overlooked historically, have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, but will also be impacted the most if this election funding is not provided. Black communities are vulnerable to voter suppression laws and strategies. And so I had read an NPR study that confirmed that Black voters are 4 times as likely to report racial discrimination when trying to vote or even participate in politics. And so our community has been neglected when it comes to voter registration and voter education. On top of that, now we have COVID-19, which has presented a unique situation and brings a different set of challenges. And so for 2020, we need to ensure our community is able to register to vote, but also the election process is safe, secure, and accessible for all voters to participate. And so this legislation, reform and election funding is necessary to ensure the Black voters are not disenfranchised. And securing these funds and making sure the money falls into the right hands is extremely important. So yes, we do agree that we need early voting and extend the early voting periods, postage paid, vote by mail, but also for the voting places or polling places that are open, make sure they are safe. Historically, closing polls in Black communities was a method of voter suppression. And so if we have a limited number of polls open, we must ensure that decisions regarding which polls are open is equitable, so all voters can go to a location that is close and makes sense for them. And same with adding drop boxes. We need to make sure those drop boxes are accessible for everyone. And so we really need an aggressive get out the vote or GOTV effort and voter education campaign, because destroying that narrative that voting by mail is unsafe or will increase voter fraud is extremely important. Encouraging people to update their voter registration now to ensure they get a ballot in the mail and that they do not have to go to the polls. And also reaching out to college students and high school students that have turned 18 and now can vote. Funding is also needed to contact those individuals showing up as inactive in our voter records and make sure that they are actually inactive because they have left the state. It's important, too, that we support organizations that are going into the Black community to register people to vote. So those are organizations like CBWPA, NAACP, and also including jails. I think, it's not a surprise for anyone, hopefully on this call, that, Black people are overrepresented in jails. And so you have organizations, especially in Colorado, like the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, that goes into jails and also registers individuals to vote. But ultimately, we know that lack of participation in the political process translates to a lack of political power. So meaning we are unable to elect candidates that represent our values and understand our issues, and then we lose the power to enact legislation priorities, right? And so what I would consider a successful democracy requires the full participation of all its citizens. And that's why restoring the Voting Rights Act and securing election funding is so important for our community.
Well, thank you, Tamra. We really appreciate you joining us tonight and the information that you've provided on your organization. Next, we are going to turn to Dusti with Color.
Thank you all. I know it's been a long day and people are probably zoomed out. I know I am. But my name is Dusti Gurule. So I want to honor people's time. And so I'll be brief with my remarks. Dusti Gurule, I'm the Executive Director for the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights. Color is a 22-year old organization who has worked to engage the Latino community of all ages and to ensure that our community, who is often, like other communities of color, disproportionately impacted by policy decisions made by elected officials, also appointed officials, and by ballot measures. And so we work to ensure that that connection and that access is a priority, and that our community's voices are part of the decision-making process. And so our work really centers around communities, Spanish-speaking communities, young people, because as many of you know, the Latino community, we have a lot of young people. We have a lot of like older folks too. So our community continues to grow. And I think with the census, which is another issue that we're working on to ensure that our community is counted, because as you all know, I won't preach to the choir how important and connected the census is to our democracy, to who represents us, who gets elected, how many seats that we have, how much federal resources come to our state and to our neighborhood and to our communities. So we work really to connect those dots and ensure that people are active in the democratic process. And all of this with, to add to Tamra's, what she, added about the disproportionately attacks on communities of color and active preventing people of color from voting. So it's not like the slate was clean and we just need to get our people out to vote. So we're working to, yes, one, make voting more accessible, but there's also a lot of generational trauma that we're working with and dealing with, and ensuring that people, particularly now with COVID and coming off the heels of the public charge and the verbal attacks from the person in the White House against communities of color, against immigrant communities, how important it is for us to, as advocates, and I think I appreciate all the comments from the Secretary of State and the former Secretary of State. But I just want to remind folks on this call that a lot of that work, and Nicole, you mentioned it, all the work that New Era has done, a lot of that work has come from advocates on the ground who are trusted messengers for these communities. And so a lot of the changes weren't just sometimes out of the goodness of our elected or appointed officials. Like, we as community members need to continue to hold people accountable and partner with each other. And how can we be creative with our June 30th election coming up soon? Like, I challenge all of us, and I'm willing to partner with other people and organizations to help make that connection about how important this election is when people are, dying, they've lost their jobs, they don't have access to healthcare. Like, how can we continue to promote our democracy and voting this June and in November, when all of this, stuff is happening at the same time? So, we continue to work and to be a presence, both with our state level electeds and our congressional delegation. And I, again, want to thank Senator Bennet, who has always been a great advocate for our community, and for Congressman Crow, who I appreciate a lot of the things that he's been working on. So I just wanted to throw out there that Colode is here, and we're interested and willing to partner on how we can really help turn out our communities and make this election accessible to everyone who is eligible to vote. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dusti. We really appreciate your comments and you joining us tonight. I do want to echo Dusti's comments that it is getting late, and I know people in general have a lot of Zoom fatigue lately. So we appreciate you all sticking with us. We were fortunate to have a lot of fabulous speakers. So we have had a really packed agenda. We do have some important questions for our guests. We're going over a little bit, but we do want to, provide our audience with the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. And just in the interest of the hour and in consideration of people's time, if we could keep our responses to maybe 60 seconds or so, that would be fantastic. And the questions really are directed at all three of you. So if you could kind of just jump in as you see fit. Our first question: while Colorado offers options like vote by mail and early voting, too many states don't offer these options or proactively try to suppress the vote, leaving voters with the unfortunate choice of choosing between their health and their vote. What voting options do you think are most important to implement nationwide in order to provide the communities you each represent access to the ballot?
I guess I'll answer real quickly. I don't think it's a one option. I think we need to have varied options because people are in different places within their lives. And so the more accessible we can make it, the better for everyone.
Right, and I agree with that. Within our communities, we do have separate buckets, seniors, youth, and so forth. So, the mail-in ballot, yes, that helps a lot, but we do have to have different options it will be a mix of options that would be helpful for our communities.
Including language access. Sorry, I forgot to add that.
Yeah, I agree. I'll double down on these lovely ladies. And I'll also say that I think the biggest barrier that we see for young people is, even if we have all of these different modes of voting, is access to information on how, when, and where to vote. And that's why organizations like ours, like Dusti had mentioned, are so important as trusted messengers to our communities in order to provide reliable information to them about how to cast their vote safely. And so, yes, vote by mail is extremely important in expanding access, and yet there's still a gap of information that it's really important for organizations to fill and for elected officials to be dedicated to engaging communities around.
Thank you all. One more question. This pandemic has hugely impacted the lives of Americans across the country, and I imagine people are feeling discouraged or fatigued. What advice or motivation would you provide participants on the call tonight to continue to fight for our right to vote? And maybe we could just go in reverse order. Nicole, since you're up on the screen, maybe if you want to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say that there's a reason why every single effort to oppress or disenfranchise communities starts with the right to vote, right? Because people understand how important and valuable that right is. And even in this moment when all hope seems lost, like showing up and exercising our right and our democracy is the greatest way we know to achieve change and to achieve justice. And so that's why we really encourage young people to show up for all elections. All elections are important, not just our big fancy national ones, but our local ones, our municipal ones, because the process of democracy is the greatest process that we've got to achieving justice.
Fantastic. Let's see if we stick with reverse order. Tamra, would you like to jump in?
Thank you. Right. So for our community, we have this long history where, Black folks have lost their lives, their livelihood to exercise their right to vote. And it is a right, right? And so we have to make sure that, we're sharing information. I think information is the key, right? To make sure that, we're fighting not only to have our mothers and fathers and daughters and sisters and brothers to make sure they register to vote. If you're on this call and folk, you need to encourage them to register to vote. And once they register and they get that ballot, encourage them to vote. It's a constant fight. So you shouldn't only vote when it's time for a presidential election. You should vote every time you get a ballot in the mail or every time you have the opportunity. And so it's extremely important that we push that as a community, because I know in Colorado, 50% of the African Americans that are eligible to vote, well, out of everyone that's eligible to vote, only 50% are actually registered. So, we just have to push that as a community.
Yeah, and I would just say that I would add that I think the Latino community, we have a large proportion who are eligible, who are not registered, but then those that are registered, to get them to turn out. And I think one of my mentors who, the way we talk about and break down the process, because the process wasn't created for a full democratic participation, we need to change that, but to make it real for everyone. And so the census is a perfect example, connecting how someone is counted in their household then determines how many congressional districts you get, or how many resources a community gets. Or, one of the taglines that we say at Color is elections matter, representation matters, and even people who are elected, depending on the office, they appoint people who make decisions who impact people's everyday lives. And I think the crisis that is showing us right now is really taking the cover off those most vulnerable among us, people who lost their job, who don't have, time to take off to take care of their family or themselves, like making those direct connections and how they impact people's lives. It's directed to and connected to who was elected or what ballot initiative or what question was elected. So making those real life examples of how important it is to have people voting, not just for candidates, but also on all of the ballot measures and questions at all the different levels.
Well, thank you so much, Dusti, Tamra, Nicole. We really appreciate all of you being here, your tireless work to protect our right to vote. Thank you for sticking with us to the end of the program and for providing all of these valuable insights and information on your organizations. So thank you so much. Now, I'd like to reiterate some of the things that we can all do to help secure our vote and protect our elections. First, we urge you to contact your senator and demand that they include at least $4 billion in the upcoming stimulus bill. It's essential that states have sufficient funding to implement the reforms that are needed to protect the integrity of our elections, voting by mail and early voting in particular. And secondly, we encourage you to make your voice heard by writing a letter to the editor calling on Congress to pass funding to secure our elections in the next COVID stimulus package. Letters to the editor are a great way to share your message, and we need to push Congress to act urgently. And finally, let's not forget that social media is another important way to share this message and to really urge action. Thanks again to all of our incredible speakers tonight and for all the work that you've done and will do to make sure that our democracy is accessible to all. I'll now turn back to Toni to close.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. This has been a wonderful panel, and I've certainly learned a lot. Even though I learned a lot from the league, this was a very great course in voting rights and voting activities. So I want to thank everybody who has participated and for all the questions. If you are from Colorado, you may know that many voting best practices are already in place. And we've mentioned several of them: vote by mail and, same day registration and those kinds of things. However, I want to emphasize that it's important to ensure that across the nation, everyone is given the same voting rights. Americans should not have to choose between their health and their right to vote. Everyone in the country should have the same opportunities. So again, I thank you very much for being here and participating, and good night.